This video was brought to you by Nebula. Over the last week or so, Ukrainian officials have started sounding the alarm about an incoming Russian offensive. In fact, Ukrainian intelligence told The Telegraph that Russia was preparing for an offensive with over 300,000 troops and 2,000 tanks. And an anonymous Ukrainian official told Foreign Policy that they expect another offensive sometime before February 24th. Which would mark 1 year since the war began. True to form, Monday saw another round of Russian missile strikes on Ukrainian cities, leading to NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg actually saying that the Russian offensive has already begun, noting that the Russian army was sending more troops and weapons to the front lines in Donbas. So in this video, we thought we'd take a look at the new Russian offensive that both NATO and Ukraine are apparently anticipating, what tactics the Russians might use, and whether it actually stands a chance of succeeding. So, let's start by trying to figure out whether or not this offensive is actually happening. And to be honest, there have been some signs that Russia is at least preparing for a new offensive around Donbas, because both the Russian army and Wagner mercenary groups have sent more forces to the region, especially around Bakhmut. For example, increased troop concentrations in Soledar, a small town just north of Bakhmut, helped the Wagner group progress west to Krasnahora, which puts Ukrainian positions in Bakhmut under even more pressure. Similarly, the Russian army tried to use its newfound manpower advantage to take Vuhledar, a tiny town just to the south of Donetsk. But things didn't go quite to plan after multiple Russian vehicles were blown up by mines, forcing a hasty retreat. And the Wagner group actually described the effort as scandalous in its ineptitude. It's not just these troop mobilizations that suggest something more is coming though. It's also worth noting that Russian government expenditure jumped by a massive 59% in January, well above what anyone expected. And this steep increase might be in preparation for a new, costly offensive. The timing would also make sense, because the longer the stalemate in Donbas persists, the more impotent the Russian army appears, and the more time that the Ukrainians have to improve their fortifications. The Kremlin is also coming under financial pressure. While the Russian economy has held up relatively well, falling oil revenues and increased military spending mean that the Russian state now has a hefty deficit of about 1.8 trillion rubles a month, which would imply an annual deficit of roughly 15% of GDP. While the Russian state isn't going to run out of money anytime soon, this clearly isn't cheap. And a budget deficit that size would represent the largest anywhere in the world, and the largest in Russia's modern history. So it's understandable for financial reasons why they might want to get things moving a little faster. Any Russian offensive would also have to happen before March, which is when the infamous Ukrainian mud season sets in, and when the first batch of Western tanks are expected to arrive on the battlefield. You get the idea then. There are some provisional signs that Russia is lining up for a new offensive, and the timing would make sense. Putin has an incentive to make territorial gains as soon as possible, especially before the mud season kicks off in March. However, despite what Ukrainian officials have been saying, it's not clear that a Russian offensive has actually started. While the Russians have been probing Ukrainian positions in Donbas, especially around Bakhmut, this is pretty much what's been going on for the last 4 months or so, and it's not like the pace of the advance has accelerated recently. Similarly, satellite data shows no evidence of a massive troop or armor buildup, which is what you'd expect before a big offensive, especially given Russia's limited logistical abilities. That's because without a significant buildup of forces, the Russian army won't have the combat firepower to make the sweeping advances desired by the Kremlin, at least according to the UK Ministry of Defence. So what is going on then? Has the Russian advance actually started, And if so, where is it? Well, there does seem to be a new Russian offensive going on, insofar as Russian forces in Donbas are being more aggressive, actively probing Ukrainian positions and committing more troops to these offensives. However, the actual number of troops in the region hasn't changed all that much, and we're definitely not seeing anything like the hundreds of thousands of troops the Ukrainian intelligence was warning about early this month. This is bad news for the Kremlin, because without a significant increase in troop numbers, Russian forces are unlikely to make significant gains anytime soon. It's also becoming increasingly clear that Russian forces lack a qualitative advantage over the Ukrainians. So the only way for them to make gains is by exploiting their manpower advantage. This is exactly why the Wagner Group have been able to make such progress around Bakhmut. They've recruited thousands of prisoners from penal colonies across Russia and used their sheer weight of numbers to overwhelm the Ukrainians, as well as employing extremely costly tactics on the battlefield. Unfortunately for Putin, however, the Russian army at large doesn't yet have a decisive manpower advantage. Typically, attacking forces need roughly 3 times as many men as defending forces. And while the Russians definitely do outnumber the Ukrainians, there have been reports that the Wagner Group alone have 50,000 personnel in the region, which would be about as many as the Ukrainians. They definitely don't have the required 3-to-1 ratio, which is perhaps the main reason they've been unable to make significant progress. On top of that, this looks unlikely to change anytime soon. There's little evidence that Putin is planning another wave of mobilization, presumably because it will be politically difficult, and because there have even been reports that the Wagner Group is running out of penal convicts because word has got back to Russia's penal colonies that less than 20% of convicts who join the Wagner Group actually survive. Now, this doesn't mean that further Russian gains are impossible. The Russian army has at least another 100,000 troops in training, and Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut are under real pressure. Nonetheless, if this is the much-anticipated Russian offensive, it's proving deeply underwhelming, and this bodes well for the Ukrainians, which are apparently planning their own offensive in the spring. But while Russia and Ukraine are rarely out of the news cycle, there are plenty of other places around the world that are underestimated and under-discussed, some of which you may have never even heard of. So, our friends over at Wendover Productions have a whole series where they dive into how and why some of the world's most remote settlements exist, from remote communities in the middle of Australia to why one of Italy's most visited places is dying. That series, Extremities, is exclusively available on Nebula, the streaming service that we're building with a bunch of our creator friends, many of whom you likely already know and love. And if you sign up to Nebula, you'll find all of our videos ad-free and occasionally before they're even released on YouTube. On top of that, you'll also find a whole bunch of TLDR explainers available exclusively on Nebula, plus an extended version of our show, The Daily Briefing, every single weekday. As I say though, there's more than just TLDR on Nebula. There's a whole bunch of other original series that we know you'll love, like Real Life Law's Incredible Modern Conflicts, which breaks down contemporary disputes around the world, Neo's Underexposure, which runs through contentious and controversial topics you wish you'd always know more about, and of course Extremities. All of these things are exclusively available on Nebula, just like our extended daily briefings and a whole bunch of other exclusive TLDR content, which will never make it to YouTube. So if you want to sign up, the best way to do it is using our link in the description, which, with our special discount, gets you the whole service for just a couple of pounds a month. A couple of pounds which doesn't just go to some weird sponsor, but directly goes to educational creators like us. And that helps us out a whole lot, as does watching on Nebula more generally. So thanks for signing up, and we'll see you on Nebula.